What we're going to do now is I want to teach you how to do binding on an armhole. I know we've done bias binding on a seam, but when we do binding on a curved line, it becomes slightly different. There's a little bit of a trick to it. So using our bodice block where we put our neck facing on in the last lesson, I want you to, we haven't joined the side seams, I want you to cut yourself in your calico a strip of bias binding. It must be cut on the bias of the fabric. If you are not sure about what I'm talking about, please go back to your notes in module 1 of cutting fabrics and where the bias is. You need to cut it approximately just bigger than about 3 centimeters, maybe a little bit bigger, because when you're learning with binding, the bigger the binding to begin with, the easier it is to learn about it. Cut a strip long enough to do 1 armhole. Okay, I'm going to get going and show you how we start. Right, we always work from the right side, moving on to the, on the wrong side, moving on to the right side. You're going to place your bias binding. Now we stitch bias binding with a foot stitch. Okay, what I want to show you is as I'm going to stitch around the corner, I am going to stretch the bias binding so that it rolls up. Can you see that? That will ensure that when I bring it to the right side, it's not going to bubble. Okay, you need to stretch it around corners. You can leave it plain on the straights and stretch it around corners again. I'll go quite slowly while I sew, and I will explain as I go along. So, placing it in, okay, I'm working on a foot stitch, okay, which is basically the foot is the right-hand side of my needle on my presser foot. Okay, start. Forward and back. Now I'm doing a curve here. This is the curve of my armhole. So I am stretching, I'm pulling. Can you see how I'm pulling my binding? And I'm keeping the raw edges together and I'm pulling my binding. Okay, I'm going to try and keep my knuckles out the way. Okay, making sure that the raw edges stay together. Now that I'm on a stretch piece, I'm quite happy that the bias binding is not pulled too much. I do add a little bit of tension to it, okay, because binding rolls much nicer when it's got a slight bit of tension to it, okay. So that's going a lot smoother, as you can see. I'm coming now to my front armhole and the curve, and I'm going to start stretching my bias binding again. Okay, keeping the... If you find it's getting a bit tricky, put your needle in, lift your presser foot up, and move your garment fabric if necessary. What you are wanting to avoid is doing any pleats on either the top or the bottom. Okay, so that is our first line of bias binding, and I want you to see, I'm just going to cut mine short. When I lie this flat, can you see how the binding is naturally pulling up and wanting to roll over to the other side? That is what the stretching has caused. Okay, what we're going to do then is, if you want, you can press it this way, but you possibly shouldn't need to, but it's up to you. If you're working with a fabric that isn't too stable, then you might want to press it. I don't need to press mine. I'm then going to turn my bodice over and I'm going to roll my bias binding onto the right side. I do that by tucking it in and then folding it over where my stitching is. So I always start with my shoulder, it's easier for me. And you should see, as you can see, it's curving here all nicely on its own, which means that I've got my tension just perfect of my turning. Okay? It should be following. Bias binding should not change the shape of your garment. Oh, I've got a little step there. Let me just work it out. There we go. Should not change the shape. So your curved line should never become straight. It must remain straight, curved. So as you can see there, I'm just going to turn the direction of this pin. Okay, because that's the direction that I'm going to be sewing. If you wish, you can trim this inside seam if it's easier for you. Some seamstresses much prefer to do it that way, others are happy. It depends for me, it depends on the fabric I'm working with as to whether I wish to trim it or not. So again, here, you'll see it's curling quite nicely. I'm going to try not cover you. And you can see there how, what I want you to see is how my armhole has not changed shape. Can you see that? The binding has not forced it straight. It has remained the curve that it originally was. Okay, now we're going to stitch on the edge of our bias binding to close it. Okay. Alright, you always leave bias binding at the end on either side. You need that as a handling thing. You know, as you can see, I can hold it here and it holds it closed. Okay, so let's stitch it nicely on the edge. Okay, as you see, I did sew the pins in the direction so that they are pointing, the pointy side is at the needle, so I can slip them out. As I get close to them, you can see there, I can now slip the pin out. It's not in my way. Because it's a little bit tricky to perpendicular pin on bias binding and stuff. And I close it. And you can see I've left a nice handling piece of binding there. Right? Cut your threads. Okay, and you can see that's a very nice piece of bias binding, kept to the shape of my armhole, as you can see when I fold it in half. Okay, I'm going to flip to the back so you can have a look at the back and see there, nice. And when you press it, this little puckering here should disappear. When I press it, I haven't pressed it. I just want to quickly sew the side seam closed with you here, so you can see what we do with this piece of information now. Okay, so again, as it's our side seam, we know we're going to put right side together. You place your boundary. Now my side seams are not going to match simply because I haven't put in my bust dart. But for this exercise, I think it's fine that we, in fact, I am going to very quickly sew in my bust dart. We must keep it right at all points. So there's my bust dart. You guys have done this already, so I am going to speed through this. Okay, the two darts. Nips together. Right, bust dart in. Right. So now, and the bust dart will press up. When you are joining your side seam and you've got binding on, what you're going to do is please make sure that your binding is perfectly matched. Okay? And horizontal pin it so that when I open it you can see that my two bottoms are at the same place. Okay? And you will match your hem. Okay? So now when you start stitching, with your seam allowance, 1 centimeter, you should not have a step here. Can you see? If we zoom in, you can see that my bindings are at exactly the same place. Okay? You would then press your seam open. Alright, and what we do with the binding is you cut it a little bit longer and you would tuck it in and tack it down by going over your original binding stitch. Okay, and then sometimes what happens is machinists actually catch it there by hand. Okay, to keep it nice and neat, you do the same on the other side. Cut it slightly shorter, enough for a turn back. And then by machine, you can catch it all by hand if you're more comfortable with that. But as you advance as a seamstress, you actually find working with your machine is a quicker option for you. Alright, so when looking at our armhole, we will see there's our nice binding armhole. Our side seam is nicely joined, and that will be caught down, and our line binding has been caught off. It looks a little bit untidy because I've used different colored thread, but you can see it sitting nice and neatly there. And on the right side, if I turn it to the right side, I'm going to keep my hand in the neck, I think, so you can see the shape, which is easier. You'll see there you have a nice bound armhole.